The envelope arrived at Barry Goldwater's Phoenix office on a sweltering October morning in 1966, delivered by a courier who refused to identify himself and disappeared into the desert heat before Goldwater's staff could ask questions. Inside, the Arizona senator found documents that would force him to confront the most painful decision of his post-presidential political career: whether to expose the corruption of the man he was grooming to be conservatism's future, or to remain silent and watch the movement he had built become a tool of the very military-industrial complex he had spent his career opposing. The first page bore the letterhead of Lockheed Corporation and was marked "Confidential, Eyes Only." It was a detailed accounting of financial contributions to Ronald Reagan's California gubernatorial campaign, listing amounts that far exceeded any legitimate corporate political involvement, and revealing a level of defense industry coordination that suggested something far more systematic than normal campaign support. Think Ronald Reagan was a grassroots conservative hero? Think again. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Barry Goldwater discovered about Reagan's rise will shock you. Tell me in the comments, should political movements accept money from anyone who supports them, or do the sources matter? Let's uncover the truth about how conservative icons are really made. Barry Goldwater had been watching Ronald Reagan's political evolution with a mixture of pride and concern throughout 1966. The former Hollywood actor had first captured conservative attention with his electrifying speech supporting Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, a televised address that had raised more money in a single evening than any political speech in American history. Reagan's "A Time for Choosing" had transformed him overnight from entertainment celebrity to conservative spokesman, and his subsequent decision to run for California governor had thrilled conservatives who saw him as the charismatic leader their movement had always needed. But as Reagan's campaign gained momentum throughout 1966, Goldwater had noticed troubling signs that the movement he had helped create was being co-opted by interests that had nothing to do with conservative principle. Reagan's sudden access to unlimited campaign funds, his sophisticated media operation, and his carefully crafted policy positions on defense spending all suggested the influence of forces that had previously shown little interest in conservative ideology. Now, staring at Lockheed's confidential financial records, Goldwater was learning the full scope of what appeared to be a systematic effort by the military-industrial complex to recruit and control conservative political leaders. Reagan was not just receiving support from defense contractors. He was being created by them, shaped and funded and positioned as the conservative alternative to liberal politicians who might threaten defense spending. The Lockheed document detailed a $500,000 contribution to Reagan's campaign, an enormous sum in 1966, equivalent to millions in today's dollars, that had been channeled through a network of shell companies designed to conceal its corporate origin. But more disturbing than the amount was the document's clinical description of what the contribution was intended to purchase. Investment in Reagan gubernatorial campaign, the Lockheed memo explained, represents strategic positioning for California defense contract negotiations and development of reliable political asset for future federal-level operations. Subject demonstrates optimal combination of conservative credibility, media effectiveness, and policy flexibility necessary for long-term corporate interests. The language was chilling in its calculated assessment of Reagan as a political commodity rather than an independent leader. Lockheed was not supporting Reagan because they shared his conservative principles. They were supporting him because they believed he could be controlled and used to advance corporate interests that had nothing to do with constitutional government or conservative ideology. Goldwater turned to the second document in the envelope, which revealed that Lockheed was not acting alone. General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop, and a dozen other major defense contractors had formed what they called the California Political Investment Consortium, pooling resources to ensure Reagan's election and establish him as a reliable ally for defense industry interests. The consortium's planning documents read like a corporate takeover manual rather than political campaign strategy. Objective 1. Establish subject as credible conservative alternative to anti-defense liberal candidates. Objective 2. Ensure subject's policy positions align with defense industry priorities while maintaining appearance of ideological independence. Objective 3. Develop subject as model for future conservative recruitment in other states. The implications were staggering. Reagan's gubernatorial campaign was not a grassroots conservative insurgency. It was a carefully orchestrated corporate operation designed to place a defense industry asset in the California governor's mansion while using conservative ideology as political cover. The movement that Goldwater had built on principles of limited government and constitutional restraint was being hijacked by the very military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had warned against. But the most disturbing document in the envelope was a transcript of a recorded conversation between Reagan and a consortium representative, discussing the policy commitments that corporate funding would require. The recording revealed a Reagan who was far more calculating and flexible about conservative principles than his public persona suggested. "Mr. Reagan," the corporate representative was recorded saying, "we need assurance that your administration will prioritize defense contract awards to consortium members and oppose any legislative attempts to reduce California defense spending. We're not asking you to abandon your conservative positions. We're asking you to understand that conservative governance includes protecting American defense capabilities." Reagan's response revealed the sophisticated political mind behind the folksy exterior. "I understand completely. My conservative principles include strong national defense, and strong national defense requires a healthy defense industry. I see no conflict between conservative ideology and supporting the companies that keep America safe." The conversation continued, with Reagan accepting specific policy commitments that would benefit consortium members while maintaining plausible deniability about the corporate influence behind his positions. He would support expanded defense spending, oppose environmental regulations that might affect defense contractors, and ensure that California's regulatory environment remained friendly to defense industry operations. Goldwater set down the transcript with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. The man he had been grooming as conservatism's future was apparently willing to prostitute conservative principles for corporate money, accepting a level of policy direction that transformed him from independent leader into corporate puppet. But Goldwater also understood that Reagan's corruption, if that's what it was, represented something larger and more dangerous than personal moral failure. The defense industry was systematically recruiting conservative political leaders, using conservative ideology as a vehicle for advancing corporate interests that had nothing to do with limited government or constitutional principles. The following week brought additional intelligence that confirmed Goldwater's worst fears about the scope of corporate manipulation in conservative politics. A source within the consortium provided evidence that Reagan's recruitment was part of a national strategy to identify and support conservative candidates who would reliably support defense spending while maintaining credibility with voters who opposed big government. Phase 1, California. The strategic planning document explained, establish Reagan as model for corporate-supported conservative leadership. Phase 2, national expansion. Identify and recruit conservative candidates in key states using Reagan template. Phase 3, federal positioning. Develop Reagan or similar assets for presidential campaigns that advance defense industry priorities. The document continued with clinical assessments of other potential conservative recruits, analyzing their policy flexibility, media effectiveness, and corporate compatibility, as if they were products being evaluated for market potential rather than political leaders being assessed for principled leadership. Goldwater realized that he was witnessing the birth of what would later be called crony capitalism, the systematic corruption of conservative politics by corporate interests that used conservative rhetoric to advance decidedly non-conservative objectives. The movement he had built on opposition to big government was being transformed into a vehicle for corporate welfare and defense industry influence. The intelligence also revealed that consortium leaders viewed Goldwater himself as a potential obstacle to their strategy. Internal memos described him as ideologically rigid and insufficiently pragmatic about corporate conservative cooperation. They recognized that his reputation for principled independence made him unlikely to accept the kind of policy direction that Reagan had agreed to. But they also understood that his influence in conservative circles made him dangerous to their long-term objectives. On November 2, 1966, 3 days before the California gubernatorial election that would make Reagan a national conservative figure, Goldwater made a decision that would test every principle he claimed to represent. He would confront Reagan directly about the corporate financing and policy commitments, giving the man he had hoped would lead conservatism's future one last chance to choose independence over corporate control. The meeting took place in a private dining room at the Beverly Hills Hotel, chosen because it provided both privacy and the kind of upscale setting that would appeal to Reagan's Hollywood sensibilities. Goldwater arrived early, carrying copies of the consortium documents that would either destroy Reagan's political career or force him to abandon the corporate support that was making his career possible. Reagan entered the dining room with the confident bearing that had made him a movie star and was transforming him into a political phenomenon. Even in private, he projected the kind of natural charisma that made people want to believe whatever he was selling. But Goldwater had seen too much of Washington's corruption to be impressed by charm that concealed moral flexibility. "Ron," Goldwater began without preamble, "we need to talk about your campaign financing and what it means for the conservative movement." Reagan's response was immediate and defensive. "Barry, if you're concerned about corporate support for conservative candidates, I'd remind you that we can't build a movement without resources. The liberal establishment has unions and foundations. Conservatives need business support to compete effectively." "That's not what this is about," Goldwater replied, pulling out copies of the consortium documents. "This is about whether conservative leaders work for conservative principles or for the corporations that fund their campaigns." Reagan's demeanor shifted as he recognized what Goldwater was showing him. The confident politician was replaced by a careful actor who understood he was being confronted with evidence of activities that could end his political career before it had truly begun. "Barry," Reagan said slowly, "I hope you're not suggesting that accepting business support compromises conservative principles. Pro-business policies are conservative policies. Pro-business policies and corporate cronyism are two different things," Goldwater shot back. "Conservative principles support free markets, not guaranteed government contracts for specific companies. They support limited government, not government-corporate partnerships that benefit connected interests at taxpayer expense." The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental philosophical divide that would define conservative politics for decades to come. Reagan argued that conservative success required accommodation with corporate interests that shared some conservative objectives, even if that accommodation required policy commitments that might conflict with pure conservative ideology. Goldwater argued that conservative principles were meaningless if they could be purchased by any interest group with sufficient resources. "Ron," Goldwater said with the moral authority that had made him conservatism's conscience, "the defense contractors supporting your campaign don't care about constitutional government or limited federal power. They care about defense contracts and regulatory protection. If you accept their money and their policy direction, you're not advancing conservative principles. You're advancing corporate welfare." Reagan's response revealed the sophisticated political calculus behind his folksy exterior. "Barry, politics is the art of the possible. Pure ideological positions might satisfy conservative intellectuals, but they don't win elections or change policies. If corporate support allows me to advance conservative objectives while also serving legitimate business interests, I don't see the moral problem. The moral problem, Goldwater replied, is that you're allowing corporate interests to define what conservative objectives are acceptable and which ones are too threatening to pursue. You're giving them veto power over conservative policy in exchange for campaign contributions. The debate continued for over an hour, with Reagan defending his corporate relationships as pragmatic coalition building and Goldwater condemning them as fundamental corruption of conservative principles. Neither man was willing to concede that the other's position had merit, and both understood that their disagreement represented more than personal philosophical differences. Reagan was articulating a vision of conservative politics that accepted corporate influence as inevitable and sought to channel that influence toward generally conservative objectives, even if specific policies might benefit particular corporate interests. Goldwater was defending a vision of conservative politics that maintained ideological independence, regardless of the political costs, refusing to compromise principles for resources or electoral success. "Barry," Reagan said as their meeting drew toward its inevitable conclusion, "you built a movement based on principle, and I respect that achievement. But movements that can't adapt to political realities don't survive to implement their principles. Sometimes, accepting imperfect alliances is the price of achieving possible victories." Goldwater's response reflected his understanding that some victories were more costly than defeats. "Ron, if conservative victories require us to abandon conservative principles, then we haven't won. We've just changed the label on the same old political corruption. The defense contractors supporting your campaign opposed me in 1964 because they knew I couldn't be bought. If they're supporting you, it's because they believe you can be." The accusation hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Reagan understood that Goldwater was not just criticizing his campaign financing, but questioning his fundamental integrity as a conservative leader. Goldwater understood that Reagan was not just defending his political strategy, but rejecting the ideological purity that had defined the conservative movement. "What do you want me to do?" Reagan finally asked. "I want you to return their money and reject their policy commitments," Goldwater replied. "I want you to run as an independent conservative who owes nothing to any interest group except the voters who elect him. I want you to prove that conservative leaders can't be purchased." Reagan's response was immediate and final. "Barry, that's political suicide. Without corporate support, I can't compete with Pat Brown's liberal political machine. You're asking me to lose on principle rather than win with compromise." "I'm asking you to understand that winning by compromising your independence isn't winning. It's surrender," Goldwater answered. "If conservatives can't govern according to conservative principles, what's the point of electing conservative candidates?" The meeting ended without resolution, with both men understanding that they had reached an irreconcilable philosophical divide about the relationship between principle and political success. Reagan would continue accepting corporate support and the policy commitments that came with it. Goldwater would continue opposing corporate influence in conservative politics, even if that opposition isolated him from the movement he had created. 3 days later, Reagan won the California gubernatorial election in a landslide that made him the most prominent conservative politician in America and positioned him for the presidential campaign that would follow 14 years later. His victory was celebrated throughout the conservative movement as proof that charismatic conservative candidates could win major electoral competitions when properly funded and organized. But Goldwater understood that Reagan's victory represented something more ambiguous than conservative triumph. It demonstrated that corporate interests could successfully recruit and control conservative political leaders by offering them resources and electoral success in exchange for policy commitments that served corporate rather than conservative objectives. The Defense Consortium's investment in Reagan proved spectacularly successful. As California governor, Reagan consistently supported expanded defense spending, opposed environmental regulations that affected defense contractors, and maintained regulatory policies that benefited consortium members. His positions were always defended in conservative terms, but they consistently served corporate interests that had funded his political career. More importantly, Reagan's success established a template for corporate recruitment of conservative politicians that would reshape American politics for decades. The consortium's strategy of identifying charismatic conservative candidates and providing them with resources and professional campaign management in exchange for policy commitments became the standard model for corporate political investment. Goldwater's decision not to publicly expose Reagan's corporate financing reflected his understanding that such exposure would damage not just Reagan, but the entire conservative movement at a moment when it was beginning to demonstrate electoral viability. Revealing the corporate manipulation behind Reagan's campaign would convince voters that conservative candidates were fundamentally corrupt and potentially destroy the political coalition that Goldwater had spent decades building. But Goldwater's silence also made him complicit in the corporate co-optation of conservative politics that Reagan's success represented. By refusing to expose the corruption he had discovered, Goldwater allowed corporate interests to continue recruiting and controlling conservative leaders who maintained credibility with conservative voters while serving corporate objectives. The burden of that knowledge weighed on Goldwater for the remainder of his political career. He had created a conservative movement based on principled opposition to big government and corporate cronyism, only to watch that movement become a vehicle for corporate influence and government business partnerships that violated every principle he had advocated. Years later, as President Reagan implemented policies that expanded defense spending while cutting domestic programs, increased corporate welfare while reducing social spending, and strengthened government business partnerships while claiming to support limited government, Goldwater would remember his 1966 confrontation with the man he had hoped would lead conservatism's future. Reagan's presidency would be celebrated as the triumph of conservative governance, but Goldwater understood it as something more complex. The successful corporate co-optation of conservative politics that used conservative rhetoric to advance objectives that had little to do with constitutional government or limited federal power. The documents that had revealed Reagan's corporate financing remained locked in Goldwater's office safe, evidence of political corruption that was too dangerous to reveal and too important to forget. They served as a constant reminder that political movements were vulnerable to co-optation by interests that understood how to use ideological rhetoric for non-ideological purposes. In 1987, as Goldwater prepared to retire from the Senate, he made a final decision about Reagan's recruitment documents. They would be destroyed rather than preserved for historians, taking with them evidence that might damage public confidence in conservative governance, while serving no constructive purpose in protecting future conservative movements from corporate manipulation. The decision reflected Goldwater's mature understanding that some truths were too dangerous to preserve and too painful to remember. Reagan had indeed become conservatism's most successful leader, implementing policies that advanced many conservative objectives while also serving the corporate interests that had created his political career. Whether Reagan's corporate-supported conservatism represented the triumph of pragmatic coalition building or the corruption of principled politics remained an open question that Goldwater was not prepared to answer definitively. He had seen enough of Washington's compromises to understand that political success always required moral ambiguity. But he had also maintained enough ideological independence to recognize that some compromises transformed victory into defeat. The conservative movement that emerged from Reagan's presidency was stronger, more successful, and more influential than anything Goldwater had imagined possible when he began building conservative political organizations in the 1950s. But it was also more corporate, more connected to business interests, and more willing to use government power to advance connected interests than Goldwater had ever intended. Reagan's recruitment by defense industry interests had established a template for corporate influence in conservative politics that would define Republican governance for decades. Conservative candidates would continue to receive corporate support in exchange for policy commitments. Conservative policies would continue to benefit corporate interests while claiming ideological justification. And conservative voters would continue to support leaders whose independence had been compromised by corporate influence. Goldwater's role in Reagan's recruitment, his knowledge of the corporate manipulation, and his decision not to expose it, remained one of the most morally complex decisions of his political career. He had chosen to protect the conservative movement's electoral prospects rather than preserve its ideological purity, accepting the corporate co-optation of conservative politics as the price of conservative political success. The consequences of that choice would reshape American politics in ways that neither Goldwater nor Reagan could have anticipated. Corporate influence in conservative politics would expand far beyond defense spending to include financial regulation, environmental policy, and social issues that had nothing to do with the original corporate interests that had recruited Reagan. But Goldwater's decision also reflected his understanding that political movements existed to achieve political objectives, not to maintain ideological purity in opposition. Reagan's corporate-supported conservatism had implemented conservative policies that Goldwater's principled opposition had been unable to achieve, demonstrating that political success sometimes required moral compromises that pure ideology could not accept. In the end, Reagan's recruitment represented both the triumph and the tragedy of conservative politics. The successful transformation of conservative ideology into a governing coalition that could implement conservative policies, but only by accepting corporate influence that corrupted the anti-government principles that had originally defined conservative opposition to liberal governance. Barry Goldwater's knowledge of how that transformation had been achieved remained buried with the documents that had revealed it, but its consequences continued to shape American politics long after both men had left the scene. The conservative movement had achieved the political success that Goldwater had dreamed of, but at the cost of the ideological independence that he had believed was essential to conservative integrity. Whether that cost had been worth paying remained a question that conservative leaders would continue to confront as they struggled to balance principled governance with the political realities of corporate influence, interest group pressure, and electoral competition in a democracy where money increasingly determined political outcomes. The Reagan recruitment had proven that corporate interests could successfully create conservative political leaders by providing them with resources and professional support in exchange for policy commitments. But it had also proven that conservative voters would accept such corporate influence as long as their leaders maintained conservative rhetoric and implemented generally conservative policies, regardless of the corporate interests that those policies also served. Goldwater's secret knowledge of Reagan's recruitment would remain one of the hidden stories of conservative politics, but its lessons would continue to influence American governance as future conservative leaders faced similar choices between principled independence and corporate-supported political success. The template that had created Ronald Reagan would be used to create many other conservative leaders, each facing the same fundamental choice between ideological purity and political effectiveness that had defined the relationship between Goldwater and the man he had hoped would be conservatism's future.